Are we recording? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Audit Committee meeting today. My name is Councillor Erdal Dogan. I am the Chair of the Audit Committee. Please note that this meeting is recorded by the Council for live and subsequent broadcast via the Council's internet site. Officers will introduce themselves when speaking. Item 2, apologies for absence.
Apologies from Councillor Small.
Thank you, Naz. Urgent business.
Unreported, Chair.
Declaration of interest? Nope. Any deputations, Naz?
None registered.
Thank you. So now we move on to item 6, which is the Treasury Management Strategy Statement 2025 and 2026. Can I now invite officers to introduce the report? Is that going to be Daniel and Josephine? Yep. Could you please introduce your report?
Thank you, Chair. This is the Treasury Management Strategy Statement for 2025-26. The SIPFA Code requires the Council to approve a Treasury Management Strategy at the start of each year. The Treasury Management Strategy Statement for the Council is subject to scrutiny, but also to come to Audit Committee and then to be approved by full Council on the 3rd of March. The TMSS is presented to this committee for any comments to go on to full Council. Key recommendations for committee include to consider and comment on the proposed updated TMSS for 25-26 and to recommend it to full Council for approval. To delegate to the Section 151 officer in consultation with the Chair of Audit Committee authority to agree any updates to the TMSS for 25-26 to full Council, and to note that Overview and Scrutiny Committee at its meeting on the 20th of January 2025 and the Cabinet Member of Finance and Corporate Services have been consulted in preparation of the statement. The Treasury Management is management of the Council's cash flows, borrowing and investments and associated risk. In terms of economic outlook, the impact of economic factors such as the autumn budget, slower than expected interest rate costs, Trump's elections are major influences to the TMSS for 25-26. The outlook remains uncertain. Headline CPI inflation continues to rise slightly and the interest rate is staying higher for longer. Markets are pricing two further bank rate cuts in 2025 with possible expectation for them to be full by economists. The bank rate held at 4.75% by the Bank of England in December 2024. In early Jan, the pound lost value and UK bonds yield rose sharply. In terms of local context, the Council's borrowing requirement is driven by the capital programme. In Section 3 of the TMSS, you can see Table 1, the capital expenditure, and Table 2, how it is funded. To set the budget, we have assumed the following: that the new Treasury investments made will be at an average rate of 4%. Last year it was 4.75%. And new long-term loans borrowed at an average rate of 5.5%. And that remains the same as last year at 5.5%. We've also made an assumption in the TMSS for the exceptional financial support for 25-26. An application was submitted by the Council, which provides permission to borrow or use capital receipts from sale of assets to fund revenue spend. An update will be provided by our Section 151 officer today in regards to that, and the final position has been published in terms of the draft budget that's going to scrutiny on Thursday. An assumption has been made in the TMSS regarding the exceptional financial support. The borrowing strategy remains the same as per previous years, which is 1, to secure low interest rates, and 2, to achieve cost certainty over the period for which funds are required. The cost of borrowing has increased for both short and long-term debts, and it's included in the report. In section 3.7 of the TMSS, the council held 956.9 million of borrowing and 72.6 million in treasury investments. In table 3 of section 3.7 of TMSS, it shows that new borrowing to be raised is 79.9 million by March 25 and 399.9 million by March 26. Just to note, these are cumulative figures. The new section within the TMSS, which you haven't seen before, committee, in section 3.10, it's articulating the reporting requirements, training. Our advisors who are here today are enclosed, and a little bit more detail around the exceptional financial support. In terms of the investment strategy, we have a treasury investment balance between 33 million to 84 million, and these are similar levels that were held in 25, similar levels, and are continuing 25-26. The investment in counterparties in table 7, section 5.6 remains the same. In section 8.3, it refers to the revenue budgets of the general fund and the HRA and the revenue impact of borrowing. Are there any other questions? That's the end of the report. Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask for you to just explain why on page 11 on your table 3, why the new borrowing raise jumps so alarmingly from year to year? So from 79.9 from nothing allegedly to 79.9 to 399.9. I mean, it's just leaping and bounding, the new borrowing.
So that's additional 320 million, and that's driven by the capital financing requirement, which is driven by the capital programme. And I'll bring in Taryn to talk through.
Daniel Lynch, accountant and treasury. Yeah, so the figure of 79.9 is to the end of the 31st of March 25. So it's capturing the last quarter of the financial year, whereas the 400 is for the whole next following year.
Capital spend is for the house.
Yes, in order to cover the capital expenditure, but just so that, you know, that's one quarter against a whole year. Yeah, okay, thank you.
And it's both for the general fund and the HRA.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just catching up on that. Can I just quick follow up from that? Because nevertheless, there is new borrowing to be raised, does increase extraordinarily over the next 5 years. That wasn't the question I wanted to ask, but it's triggered my question.
Yes, I mean, without repeating, it is just to cover the capital expenditure that is, you know, projected for those following years. You know, in the following years, 320, then it's 250. So
it's a cumulative total as you go year to year.
That makes more sense. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'll go back to what I was going to ask. So yeah, it's cumulative. I can get that. Yeah. So can we just go back to then the obviously we all know that we're in a very problematic economic situation and that the council is struggling, and we as councillors are struggling with making sure that our residents get the best possible services and that that is done in as fair a way and as equal a way as possible. Okay, just accepting that, I think that I feel quite challenged by this exceptional finance support and the application that to capitalise part of our capital to use for day-to-day running costs. because it's like selling, the gold, isn't it, in the pot? You sell you sell that in order to sustain a continued level of running costs. And when you say for some day-to-day services will be required, it's kind of, it raises loads of questions. What day-to-day services? What are we talking about? Is this to do with housing? Is it to do with adult social care? Is it to do with children's social care? Is it to do a mix of those things? And in terms of what happens the year after and the year after, we know that there is going to be a challenge to our finances until 2028, we've been told. So it would be not a very good planning decision to think that we're suddenly going to get better in 2026 or 2027. So if we're talking about using some of our money for some of our resources, capitalisation for some day-to-day services, then I am concerned about what happens next year and the year after and the year after, and also concerned about what that means about the stability of the organisation and our ability to raise funds through borrowing, and whether there is an impact on that or not. For that reason, I'm also concerned that this will just go off to the Cabinet on the 11th of February with my name as a member of the Audit Committee on it, without it coming back to us. I have complete faith with the Chair, and I know that he will represent us well, and also with the Section 151 officer, who's always been open and fair and transparent. But I still think that us councillors have got a job to do, and we would be really criticised if we didn't pay full attention to all the things that are happening in this pivotal moment. So I'd really like to understand why we wouldn't have those decisions brought back to an emergency meeting. Thank you.
So if I come in broadly and just cover exceptional financial support in kind of overall terms, and then we'll come on to the final question about coming back to this committee. So we have applied, as Joe's been highlighted, we did apply for exceptional financial support on the 13th of December. Our draft budget report was published for overview and scrutiny committee on Friday evening, and that shows that in order to set a balanced budget or to recommend a balanced budget for 25-26, that exceptional financial support is estimated at 37 million for 25-26. So when this report, this Treasury Management Strategy Statement was published for the Audit Committee, that was estimated, as you can see in Table 3, no, sorry, not Table 3, in Table 1, you can see that it was 20 million required in 25-26. That is now, as I say, on Friday, we published that requirement is 37 million. Now, in terms of what services, so it won't include housing, that is capital spend. So as a local authority, we currently are not allowed to borrow or use our capital receipts for our revenue spend, which is day-to-day running costs. So what the exceptional financial support will do will, if approved at the end of April, will give us that special permission. It's called a capitalisation directive. And if you look in the budget report, which I know we're not considering tonight, within the capital programme, you will see 37 million as exceptional financial support. It isn't, the way we budget it isn't earmarked around particular services. So the way we approach our budget is we recognise all of the pressures that we're facing next year, particularly around social care and temporary accommodation, but across every single service. I think probably not in this committee, but it's really important that we set a budget that we think is realistic and we recognise those pressures. That gives us a budget gap position. Then we will identify any savings that we can identify, and they were published back in November, and they were again published for overview and scrutiny committee on Friday. So what the 37 means, it's almost the budget gap that remains after those assumed savings. So it isn't earmarked to a particular service. It's saying that in order to deliver all of the services that we want to deliver in Haringey next year and recognise all the spending pressures, our income is 37 million short from where we need it to be. So it's kind of, that's the approach that we tend to take. It is the one key message I would say is we may be setting a budget or we may be setting a budget at this stage. We've still got a couple of steps to go through with an assumed 37 million exceptional financial support. That does not mean by any means that we need to use 37 million of support. So the work that we will continue to do right the way through the remainder of this financial year into next year will really try to reduce the amount of that we absolutely need to draw down. So we don't get final approval until the summer. So there will need to be some really intense work to essentially reduce our spend, increase our income, to reduce that reliance on that 37 million. But we have to make an assumption when we are setting the budget. The expectation, I think we all know, the minute you place increasing reliance on borrowing, you get into a bit of a cycle, increased borrowing costs, and interest rates are still on the higher end, I think, from where we would want them to be. So we have factored in some use of capital receipts, and I can say a little bit on that. But our expectation is it's not a long-term solution. So we will be absolutely taking all the necessary action, trying to look at every single thing we do, spending across all services to reduce any reliance on that on 26, 27 onwards. I can't sit here at this stage and guarantee that, but that's the working assumption and our expectation. The long-term stability of the organisation is that we don't want to be reliant on that exceptional financial support. In terms of just picking up, so coming back to you in terms of decision. So I suppose there is one amendment already to the Treasury Management Strategy Statement that you're seeing in front of you, in that the exceptional financial support is now estimated at 37 million. So that will be one amendment. We're not anticipate that will need to feed through into all of the figures and the borrowing requirement. We're not expecting any other significant changes, but we can, of course, I think very similar to when we were signing off accounts previously a couple of meetings ago, we can certainly share with you any changes as a committee before myself and the chair do the chair makes a recommendation to council. But in terms of the amendments, that will be the main amendment that compared to what you're seeing today. It's the value of the exceptional financial support, which will be presented and debated in full at Overview and Scrutiny Committee on Thursday before it goes to Cabinet. So I don't know, Councillor Mason, in terms of, you mentioned about decisions coming back here, whether there was any particular decisions that you thought should be coming back here.
I think that it was the idea that you would, what I've got here is that an update will be provided to the final TMSS, presented to full council 3rd of March, and the Audit Committee is asked to agree for the approval of any changes to be delegated. And so from what I'm looking at is, you've narrowed it down to changes that would be made by up to Overview and Scrutiny meeting this Thursday. In writing, I've got something slightly different. So, if we are willing to amend to put that into the minutes, and that any further changes would come back to us, then I would let that go. That would be fine.
I'm certainly happy, like I say, very similar to the arrangement that we had before. I think it will be the number around the value of the exceptional financial support, which will be what changes. But I think we will certainly update the committee before any recommendation is made to council.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would just like to be placed on record how problematic this is. And I understand the position and the urgency of it. I understand the predicament we're all in, but I think that when we begin to do this, then we are entering into a fairly dangerous place. And so therefore, I think that full transparency is really necessary. And we will be asked in our local areas to explain to residents what's happening and what accountability we've asked for. So I think it's right that we make sure that we have as much accountability as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Mason. Shall I move on? So, okay, so Councillor Ahmed.
So thank you for that. And it kind of leads on quite nicely, actually. So we appreciate that you'll be keeping an eye on it. But this morning, I guess the Telegraph spoke of us going back into recession. Whether that's true or whether that's fear mongering, it's up to debate. But I guess the thing from that article that I guess, set alarm bells is the record number of job losses that are happening in the UK. And I guess during COVID, one of the worst affected was the Hornsey and Wood Green region when it came to job losses. So are we resilient enough to, I guess, this so-called upcoming surge in job losses? Do you think we're resilient enough to that? And I guess the pressures that were put on the council through all these people that will be out of work?
Yeah, I've been asked to field that one. I'm David Blake from Arling Close, the council's treasury management advisors. I didn't read the article, but yeah, there is pressure in the economy. The labour market has been quite robust though, so although unemployment may be ticking up, it is at fairly low levels historically. In terms of borrowing costs, I think the main problem is going to be inflation, and whether inflation comes down to or stays at an adequate level for the Bank of England to be able to cut interest rates. And there are fears that some of President Trump's policies will prove to be inflationary, things like trade tariffs, etc., which could lead to higher inflation and higher borrowing costs across the globe, basically. So I think that is an area of concern. It's an area of risk, but that's factored into that borrowing forecast and that 5.5% borrowing assumption that you've got in front of you. So I don't know if I've cracked the nut there in terms of local redundancies and pressures in this area, but I think there are sort of some gloomy spots to the global economy, combined with higher interest rates, which clearly isn't ideal. But that is the situation we're in: low growth economy with higher interest rates and certainly some pressures to come.
Just before I come to you, Councillor Isidoros, Benita, you want to come in?
Thank you very much, Chair. Benita Edwards, Head of Legal Services. I'm not sure if I've misheard, but I just wanted to clarify that if Audit Committee has an expectation or a requirement that the TMSS comes back to Audit Committee for consideration, we just need to think about the timetable, because I'm not quite sure of the dates, but the TMSS will be going to full council in March, and I'm not sure whether there is a meeting of Audit Committee before then. If there isn't, and if the committee were to require that it comes back, then I think obviously you might need to just look at the timetable and tweak it a little bit for the next meeting.
Thank you. Councillor David.
Yes, thank you. First, I wanted to come back to the issue of the exceptional financial support, and then I want to ask a couple of questions about the rest of the text. On the exceptional financial support, reading paragraph 614 on page 3 of the pack that we've got, we're asking for permission to either borrow or to use capital receipts. Yeah. That doesn't mean that we have to use capital receipts as such. If we were to borrow something like 30 million, let's say next year, probably that means that we'll be saddled with some loan repayments, probably around, I don't know, £2 million, let's say a year, that kind of thing. If we are to use capital receipts, it's not only that, as it's been pointed out repeatedly, it's only a 1 year plug, but we're back to square one. We're not back to square one, but by losing the asset is the income of the asset for eternity from then on, all these other things. We don't have at the moment capital receipts that they were anywhere near this 37 million that maximum, if you like, or even less than that. Does that imply that we'll have to really do a fire sale of properties and assets? That's the starting. Associated with this is that on paragraph, is it 9.4? Yeah, 9.4, you're referring to that one of the conditions that would be an external assurance review. If you can explain what that means and whether that has got some wider implications as well. Separately now from that, I wanted, looking desperately for ways in which we might find something that we hadn't thought of in order to generate more income. Paragraph 3.2, we're repeating something like for years now, that we are avoiding to get involved in commercial activities, unlike other authorities who have got banned. I agree with that in broad terms, but I wonder whether it is worth investigating it a bit more, just in case there are some things. In the past, the council has done some safe things. When we had a DLO doing our MOTs, for example, we were making it available to the public as well, you know, the spare capacity, things like that. You know, there might be other things where some of our DLOs can play a different role. So is it worth looking at that? You know, not necessarily for next year, but for the, you know, for the longer term. And further down on table 2, you make a reference to community infrastructure levy income. It's not secret, my view from the very beginning, that we are undercharging in the west of the borough in comparison with our neighboring authorities quite substantially, etc. I don't think we do need incentives there for attracting private investment through that kind of thing. Is it worth, again, on reviewing that particular side, because it could be worth quite a bit of money? Thank you.
So in terms of the funding of exceptional financial support, so as reported in the budget report that got published on Friday, it's 37 million. The working assumption for the budget is that 10 million of that is funded through capital receipts and 27 million is funded from, so 10 million through capital receipts and 27 million through borrowing. So you'll see the 27 million so you're seeing 20 at the moment, but actually it will be 27. So in terms of the capital receipts, that 10 million is based on capital receipts that we've already received. So we have sitting in the bank, so it's in our balances. We have also got, which is usual practice, but during 25-26, we have a pipeline of already planned capital receipts. So that is not capital receipts because of our financial position. Those are capital receipts that we were going to be generating anyway. I have taken a very prudent view and only assumed 2 million from those capital receipts that are expected to come through in 25-26. So there is no assumption in there at the moment around fire sales. I think the really important point to note on that is that we absolutely have a duty of best value, and therefore any sale of any asset that we do for any reason, we need to demonstrate best value, and therefore I've taken that assumption. We will use capital receipts that we've got at this stage. If more capital receipts, so if we take those planned capital receipts in 25-26, the estimated value is more than 2 million. If we generate that, of course, it is better to use that than to borrow. Otherwise, you have borrowing costs for a very long period of time. So, you know, the very nature of this is that we'll need to take a view. If we generate more capital receipts, we can use more capital receipts. If we can't, then we reduce borrowing. So I would just emphasise that setting the budget is a working assumption, but we will have to ensure that we're putting most effective use of those capital receipts. So there's no assumption around emergency sales from any assets at this stage. In terms of sorry. So there's a couple of pieces of work that we've got underway at the moment. One is so exceptional financial support should absolutely be a last resort. It's not a long-term solution. You'll probably hear me say that a lot over the next couple of months. So we have got some external support in to help us go through every single budget line to make sure that we are as efficient as we possibly can. Every pound that we're spending offers good value for money, etc. So a bit of extra capacity to reduce that reliance on exceptional financial support. So I have to make a judgment call in terms of setting the budget, but that work will continue to hopefully reduce the drawdown. So there's that's underway, and we've also got an exercise just looking at our general financial resilience. So that includes our reserve balances, it includes our levels of debt compared to others, it looks at our governance and our setting of our budget, our delivery of savings and our track record of there, all of which are various parts that we need to absolutely get right and a tight grip on to be able to build up that financial sustainability.
Sorry, Councillor.
Yeah, if we want to use that facility, does it imply that we'll have another external auditor coming in and going through to give this assurance? Well, so we heard that we got quite a lot of pressure already, stress, trying to get everything. Is there something that there's somebody from the government has to come down and look at our books inside out?
So I'm sure KPMG colleagues will be looking at it as part of next year's audit, but in terms of the application itself, so MHCLG have undertaken a desktop exercise on our application, really to test that we really do need the level of support. So they come in and almost look at the financial sustainability, look at our reserves. They will, the process is such that we only get an in-principle agreement at the end of February. We won't get the formal approval until the summer. So the February agreement allows us to recommend a balanced budget. Contact will remain with MHCLG, which is the government department who is supporting the exceptional financial support process. There will be regular contact all the way through between the council and the government, and we would want to demonstrate that we're doing everything we can to reduce the reliance on that 37 million. So it's not another external audit or another formal assurance piece at this stage, I would say, but we will need to demonstrate that we're doing everything we possibly can.
Sorry.
So in terms of in terms of the Treasury management strategy, our approach to both investment and borrowing is largely as it is in line with previous years. There is an option to expand or look at our opportunities within commercial activity. I would say we wouldn't necessarily rule anything out, and what the strategy does gives us that opportunity to explore. It gives us the ability to explore the opportunities should they arise. I would just err on the side of caution, given our financial position at the moment and our low levels of balances and reserves available for investment. It is highly likely that we will continue to take a very risk-averse approach. However, if an opportunity arises, I'm sure we'd have a conversation with our expert colleagues to my right, and if that poses an opportunity, that would come back and would get reported through to this committee through the quarterly update. I mean, the last thing I'll say, and then I'll kind of pause, is income generation is equally as important as cost reductions in terms of balancing our budget. So I wouldn't want us to rule out anything at this stage, and I think we should be exploring all options, but with a very risk-averse approach.
Community infrastructure levy.
The community infrastructure levy.
So the community infrastructure levy, is part of one of our funding streams for the capital programme. So it's not within your report here tonight, but the full budget report also includes a capital strategy, which is new as a separate document for the current year. So the draft was published for Overview and Scrutiny Committee on Friday. And what that does is it clearly sets out that a seal is one of those key funding streams that we will consider whether there are any appropriate schemes within the capital programme that meet the requirements of the community infrastructure levy that we've received.
To clarify, that's not the question. The question is, should we review it at the moment? Because I believe that we are undercharging for development at the moment in the west of the borough.
Sorry, I will take that away. So this is the approach to seal and undercharging. Particularly, sorry, you mentioned the west of the borough. Let me take that back. Thanks.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Isadora, for your question. Rennie.
Take two. Just to clarify, so doing everything that we can, to what extent is the application for exceptional financial support tied in with a commitment to increasing council tax? And if so, what is that? And then the second question that I had was this 37.6, to what extent does that account for the increase in employer national insurance contributions that kick in from April? Were the two questions that I had. I guess where I'm getting to is, would we have had a balanced budget if it wasn't for that? And how are we managing council taxes? Thank you.
So one of the options under exceptional financial, so there's three options for exceptional financial support. One is use of capital receipts, one is borrowing. The third option is to request the ability to increase council tax above the 4.99% threshold, which is currently the referendum threshold. As set out in the budget report, we haven't put forward an option to increase council tax above the 4.99%. It was an option. It could have been part of the application. We haven't. We just assumed capital receipts and borrowing, but it is, and we know from previous years other authorities have gone down that route, but we haven't assumed that at this stage. It would require a very significant increase in council tax to address the 37 million shortfall. In terms of the employer contribution, so the way in which we budget is we, to set a realistic budget, we have to assume, we have to look at all of the pressures we're going to be facing next year. One of those pressures is the increase in national insurance. So as a local authority, we are expecting to get fully funded for direct employees, but we are expecting to see an increase, well, it could transpire as an increase in the cost of contracts that we pay, particularly within social care and children. So our budget in terms of our pressures, which our service pressures alone next year amount to 56 million, does include an assumption around increased costs as a result of the national insurance increase. What I would say is that isn't the only driver for the 37 million shortfall. It's a combination of a whole series of factors, but that absolutely is one of them.
Great. No, the reason I asked was it was a headline today about council tax increases, and I think it was Windsor and Maidenhead that were putting forward 25% increase in council taxes. So appreciate that you say it will be a lot, but doesn't seem to be within the realms of the unexpected. So thank you very much for the clarification.
Kathy, you want to come in, then I'll come in after. Thank you.
Okay, I'm slightly going back to what Councillor Diakidis said, which was about the community infrastructure levy, because I just wanted to point out that it has struck me that it's extraordinarily low sometimes on developers. And not only that, but it's not just in the West, most definitely not. It's across the board, and we do far more building in the East. So don't just look at the West. I mean, £1,000. That's ridiculous, and we've had that sort of level.
I'll take back that comment.
Do you want to come in?
Sorry, just on community infrastructure levy, as I'm sure all members are aware, it is a matter for the planning authority to consider and for an inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to assess the charging schedule. So perhaps there's a discussion to be had with the planning authority.
Yeah, thank you for clarification. Yes, Councillor Mason.
is that, of course, what we're expecting is that there's a whole raft of measures that you're looking at about how we can decrease spend and increase income, including things like dealing with voids, both in our buildings and properties and in housing, because that results in, as we know, a huge increase in homelessness and the cost of that. So all of those things are very tight and they're very expensive and need to be tightened, because we know as councillors, we know where some of that is sitting within our wards, and it's not the greatest, as we've seen in audit committee previously. But nevertheless, I think that what we know is that we are expecting you as officers to do your utmost to deal with the problems that we all face. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Again, on the exceptional financial support. So what I would like to understand is if, assuming that this is granted at the end of February, I understand that there will be some amendment that will be decided by yourself and the chair, but what I would like to understand if there is any impact in general on the Treasury strategy itself. And for instance, would be going over the affordable borrow limit, or in case this is granted, is there going to be a review of the strategy itself? Thanks.
So there won't be a review of this. So the strategy really sets out our approach to borrowing and our approach to investment. So there won't be any change in terms of that, in terms of the strategy itself. The 20 million that you are seeing in table 1, assuming nothing else changes in the next week, will become 27 million in that third column by the 31st of March. Oh, sorry. 10 million is from capital receipts, 27 of borrowing. So it's 37 exceptional financial support in total, of which 10 million is from capital receipts and 27 million is from, I'm starting to doubt myself there, 27 million is from borrowing. So at the moment, the figures that you see in all of the tables are based on borrowing of 20 million. So we will need to rerun those figures to account for 27 million of borrowing. So there will be some changes within the figures in the other tables, just to recognise the increase in the borrowing associated with that. In terms of, we will still be below, and I'm kind of looking to my expert colleague to the left. So I think your question is, will we still be within our borrowing limit and the prudential indicators? And the answer is yeah. I mean, I'd like to rerun the figures, but in terms of our headroom, essentially we can't go over our borrowing limit, and therefore we will need to be retained within that limit. So the figures that you're seeing in the strategy tonight already assume 20 million of borrowing for exceptional financial support. The only update, I say the only, is that 20 becomes 27 million as opposed to 20. So it will yeah, so it will still be within the limit, but you will see an increase in the borrowing of 7 million compared to what you're seeing tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Tyrone. So I got a question. So the 27 million from the EFS, so that will be additional borrowing. I have asked this question before, but is important for the committee to know. So does this 27 million attach to interest, and where is the money going to come from?
So the money, the 27 million will be borrowed from Public Works Loans Board, and it will be at the rate, the PWLB rate at the point that we borrow. So there's no premium that we would incur because of this exceptional support. We'd be borrowing at the same rate as if we were doing borrowing for our general capital programme, which is different. In previous years, it has been PWLB rate plus 1%. So that plus 1% has disappeared. I mean, what I would say is we still only borrow when we have to. So throughout the Treasury team will be, if it's looking like we need to actually physically borrow, we will be tracking the rates to make sure that we get the best rates at that time. But we might budget to borrow 27 million, but we won't actually borrow until we have to, just because we have balances that we would utilise first, etc. Borrowing would always be our last resort.
Thank you. Is there any further questions? Quick one.
I've noticed the reference, and sorry, I should know, about treasury investment and other type of borrowing. And it's got the treasury investment is got lower interest rate in general. What is the difference? I'm not aware. Be very helpful.
Sorry, can I just clarify? Is that the difference between, did you say treasury investments and internal?
And other investments. If you look at, I can't remember the thing. I don't remember offhand, but there are references 2 or 3 times. The one is the base rate plus 1%, the other is the base rate plus 0.4%, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you're probably referring to the Public Works Loan Board's different loan margins. So they have different rates applicable depending on the expenditure. So it's government cost of borrowing plus 0.4%. 0.4% for housing expenditure. For general fund expenditure, it's government's cost of borrowing plus 0.8%. If you don't fill in certain forms, you'll end up borrowing at government cost of borrowing plus 100 basis point 1%. So there's different margins applied depending on expenditure.
Understand what treasury management investment means, or treasury investment.
Yeah, and that's a sort of SITFA definition. Treasury management investments basically cover all your regular treasury management activities, whereas the distinction is non-treasury management investments will be things like commercial property, i.e. buying commercial assets for returns.
As I answer your question, Councillor Dagidis, if there's no any further questions on this item, I would like to read the recommendation for this report. So the recommendation for this report is 1, to consider and comment on the proposed updated Treasury Management Strategy Statement for 2025 and 26, and to recommend it to the full Council for approval. 2, delegate to the Section 151 officer in consultation with the Chair of the Audit Committee authority to agree any update to the Treasury Management Strategy Statement for 2025-2026 to full Council for approval. 3, to note that the Overview and Scrutiny Committee at its meeting on the 20th of January 2025 and the Cabinet Member for Finance and Corporate Services have been consulted in the preparation of the Treasury Management Strategy Statement. Thank you. So now,
I just clarify, does that make clear what we've been told, which is not in the reports? In other words, that the exceptional support scheme it doesn't imply exceeding the current capital receipts. In terms of capital receipts. Yeah, but I mean, I can't see it anywhere written. This is the problem. Just verbally, and then you forget it. I want it somewhere minute that is the policy.
That can be clarified in the report.
Yeah.
Can I just speak? I mean, that update is probably more appropriate for the capital strategy, which is a separate document that's part of the budget report. But let me take that away and we can look at see whether we can build something into the treasury management, which is essentially about the borrowing aspect of the exceptional financial support as opposed to the capital receipts. But let's see if we can put a line in terms of capital receipts to close off the comments that have been raised tonight.
We are agreeing, in other words, will be minuted in this meeting explicitly. Okay, thank you.
Rossetti.
Yeah, I would like to support the request because one of the questions I had was about selling assets, and then I understood that there are no new assets to be solved. So when Councillor De Kitis asked the question, I think that it would be appropriate to have something in writing as well to make sure that effectively.
Can that happen? Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, Councillor Mason.
Having something coming back to us if there were any further changes. And I'd like that to be written in as well, please.
I just come back. So the approach that we took last time when we were looking at the accounts by the previous auditors was rather than as a formal committee meeting, I emailed round to each of you just to say that, and I think it was that there was no update. If the committee is content with a similar approach this time, and I'm looking at Benita, I would be really happy to adopt a similar approach whereby we notify you of any changes, even if there's no changes, but we know there's going to be one on the figure anyway.
Thank you. I think that obviously if there's no changes, that's fine. And you've informed us about the change that's already in place. If there are further changes, I would accept that on the understanding that if a majority of us want to call that in for another discussion or meeting, then we have the right to do so.
Through you, Chair. If the matter needed to come back to Audit Committee, then obviously there's going to be a need to fix another meeting because, so that discussion could be had prior to full council, which is in March. I envisage, though, perhaps, as Taryn has suggested, if she were to email all the members, perhaps that email conversation could take place prior to implementation of the delegated authority, which Taryn would exercise following consultation with the chair. And then obviously members could perhaps liaise with the chair as needed.
Is that okay? Yeah.
I mean, the principle that we're talking about is
But if
that
there's significant changes,
if there is a change,
but if there's a significant change on the Treasury Management Report, we will be notified. If there's going to be slight change, which is on the EFS, which is the increase of 7 million, that will be also written down and sent to all members. That's my understanding. And you reckon that there should be another meeting just to discuss that?
No, not to discuss that. We've accepted. I'm suggesting that
Minuted.
we accept that, but
Yep.
if there are any further changes,
Apart from 27.
yes, we've accepted. Well, I think I've accepted those, and the issue that I'm raising is that if we just give carte blanche, we're not saying you need to come back to us if there are any further changes, and that you would be notified of them, of course, as chair, but that the members need to be notified them as well, so that we have an opportunity to comment on them.
Thank you, Chair. And in terms of the strategy itself, so I mean the 37 million is now what we are assuming in our budget. So just spoke to Daniel, and certainly this week we will rerun the figures, so we should have a final Treasury Management Strategy statement by the end of this week, and therefore I think there's plenty of opportunity. If I can commit to emailing it around to the group early next week, you've still got time. If you feel you need to have another meeting, there's still time before the 3rd of March. Okay. Yeah.
Hiram, thank you. Thank you, officers. I'll move on to the next item, which is item 7. 23-24 Statement of Accounts for External Auditors Annual Report. Can I now invite officers to introduce the report? Lead Officer Tim Cutler.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. So I think the actual statement of accounts is on the agenda as well, but maybe if I talk to our reports and then if management, I don't know, Taryn, if you wanted to say anything about the accounts summary.
Sorry, Tim. So I should have mentioned. Sorry, Tim.
No, that's.
I should have also mentioned Casey. So it's both of you. So.
No, thanks, Chair. Good evening, members and colleagues. My role here is just to introduce the papers to be presented by Tim and KPMG. And so I'll just introduce the papers and gladly step aside for Tim to take the lead. As you all know, it is a requirement by the Accounts and Audit Regulation of 2015 for local authorities to prepare their draft accounts certified by the Section 151 officer and an audit carried out on those accounts. And we came to you July last year with a draft statement of accounts 2023-24, and that's the accounts KPMG has been auditing following our presentation of the draft accounts to you. And their work covers around the core sections of the draft account, which is the narrative reports, the comprehensive income and expenditure statements, the movement to reserve statements, the balance sheets, the cash flow statements, and the notes to the accounts. This also covers the subsidiaries of the council, which is Homes for Haringey and Alexandra Alipali, Alexandra Park charity accounts, and also the pension funds accounts. So you've got a set of 3 reports with you, which KPMG will be presenting. And those reports are the auditor's annual accounts for the council, the draft year-end report for the council and the group, and the draft year-end report for pension funds. The annual report for the council and the draft year-end report for the council are for your consideration, but the draft year-end report for pensions funds is just for your noting, because that will be considered by the pensions committee and board. So what happens next after this today is that KPMG will be expressing their opinion, because there are still further works to be done. And based on the observations and the points you raise here today, we'll go back and make some amendments where necessary in the draft statement of accounts. And we ought to, by 28th of February, to have an audit opinion, published audit opinion, and finalized accounts, because what you've got here is a draft. That includes changes to the AGS that will be made to the accounts. So the Section 151 officer, after this meeting, is also required, in conjunction with the chair, to sign the letter of representation as part of the activities, next steps after this meeting today. So on that note, I'm going to be handing over to Tim to now present the papers to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Casey. Good evening, everyone. So yeah, as Casey said, we have 3 reports on the agenda, but I only propose talking to 2 of those. The third one on the pension fund report is there for noting and for some assurance, I guess, given it would be important for you to know that that audit has now been completed to allow you to approve the authority's accounts in which those pension fund accounts are reported. So it's there for that purpose only. In terms of the 2 reports that I will be talking to, I'll take the auditor's annual report first and focus on the VFM commentary, and then I'll go on, maybe pause for questions at that point, and then I'll talk to the ISA 260 completion report, maybe spend a bit more time on the accounts narrative within that report. So just a reminder about the purpose of the auditor's annual report. This is a public facing document that will sit on your website alongside the signed accounts and annual report, which gives the taxpayer assurance from us on how the authority has discharged its operations and how we've discharged our responsibilities in line with the National Audit Office Audit Code. So within this report, we have given the high-level conclusion on the financial statements audit. Now, for the purposes of this report, we do refer to a disclaimer, but as I said, I will go on and talk a little bit more about how we unpick that disclaimer within the ISA 260 report. But we have here also presented our detailed commentary on value for money and the work we have done to assess the authority's value for money arrangements. Again, crucially, bearing in mind that this is work focused on the period or the 12 months up to 31st of March 2024. And so what's important to note at this point, I think management's responses to our recommendations do make a point of this, is a lot of work has gone on since the 31st of March 2024 to address some of these points, many of which will be aware to committee members from conversations that have taken place in this room in previous months. So in summary, you will see from a point pre-Christmas where we'd identified 8 significant risks to value for money arrangements, we've concluded and followed up our work on those 8 areas to conclude on 4 areas of significant weakness. So the purpose of this report is to provide detail in those areas of weakness, but also for balance, we provide in the commentary detail on other arrangements which we believe are satisfactory, and we refer to several of those within the commentary against each of the 3 sub-criteria of financial sustainability, governance and use of resources, or economy, efficiency and effectiveness. In terms of the 4 we have raised, 2 of which are in a similar area relating to financial sustainability. They relate to the process for budget setting and also the process for identifying and monitoring cost savings. Again, no doubt this will be familiar territory from recent council and committee meetings, and indeed sort of leads up to the fact, as Tyrone has been referring to, the requirement for some of that resilience funding that you've just been discussing. So again, we've made recommendations on each of those points and management have responded positively. And no doubt as we get into the FY25 VFM risk assessment, which we hope to be doing over the next few weeks, we will follow up on those actions to form a view as to whether those weaknesses will remain in the 25 financial year. In terms of governance, we did identify a risk pre-Christmas, but we have mitigated that away, albeit we have raised some lower priority recommendations within the ISA 260 report on those areas. And within the 3rd sub-criteria around use of resources, we have retained 2 significant weaknesses to arrangements. The first one of those is around procurement and ensuring the authority puts in place effective arrangements for controlling spend and having oversight on decisions made in relation to spend. Again, it's a subject which I know has been discussed in this room on prior occasions. So really our recommendations are around pace and effectiveness of the implementation of some of the actions that have already been discussed. There's also the area of commercial property. Again, I know a subject of conversation previously. And again, our weakness is focused on the areas or potential gaps in knowledge that the authority has based on some of the history around commercial property management, largely around record keeping and the level of digitisation within the area of commercial property to allow the authority to properly monitor its obligations in relation to that portfolio. Again, we've made recommendations of those which have been accepted by management. In terms of value for money, I'll pause there and pause on the content of the annual auditor's report and welcome any questions. Again, I will move on to say more about financial statements under the next item.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Casey. Any questions? Councillor Rossetti?
I have one generic question and one a bit more specific. In this paper, we have several recommendations with several due dates, 25, but I've seen some are also going over 2027. So I just want to understand the process in sort of tracking this recommendation in the following year, because I've seen that in some cases officers have set up internal mechanism to track progress and implementation. But I would like to understand in terms of how the auditors are tracking this. And the more specific question is about agency staff. There is a statement, it's page 76, where it says that we have one of the, I think we are the 3rd borough in London with the highest number of agency staff. But then there is a statement that says the financial implications of high agency usage are broadly cost neutral. And I would like to understand the statement, how they can be cost neutral if possible. Thanks.
Yeah. So the point around agency was we highlighted it as a risk. We felt it is an area, not just from a cost point of view, but from an efficacy point of view. Obviously, ideally, you would have more substantive people in place. In terms of the cost neutrality of it, whilst an individual member of agency staff may be more expensive than a directly employed member of staff from a salary perspective, when you took into account all the on costs, the additional costs of employment that come with it, actually there's not a huge amount of difference there. So it's not a value for money point in terms of total cost. It's more an efficacy point to have so many agency staff, because of course what it doesn't give you, which arguably, you know, directly employed permanent staff do have, is that continuity, you know, career ambition, dare I say, which isn't always there with agency staff, and cumulative knowledge, which if you've got people coming in and out of the organisation on a regular basis, potentially is lost.
Yeah, that I understand it perfectly, and I agree. It's just that when I was reading about some of the daily rates, like £500 a day, so what you're trying to say is that basically once you add all the cost of a direct employee, you sort of get to the daily rate of £500?
Yeah, because don't forget, from a value for money point of view, we're there to assess whether there's a risk of significant financial loss. So again, from our point of view, that probably doesn't equate to significant financial loss. I just think it's a point worth reflecting in the commentary.
If I could just come back on Councillor Rossetti's first question about the tracking of two ways. So they form part of our annual governance statement. So the next annual governance statement that you see for the 24-25 accounts will need to pick up on each of the recommendations and provide an update. And I'm sure our external audit colleagues will be looking at our progress against any recommendations when they come to do the value for money report as part of the next financial year.
Just to respond specifically to that point. So yes, any recommendations we raise this year, we will be following up as part of the FY25 financial year. Probably worth noting that the recommendations that we've put in the auditor's annual report clearly will be in the public domain. The ones in the ISA 260 report will be public in the sense they're on this meeting agenda, but they're not ones that necessarily will respond to significant weaknesses within the value for money conclusion. That said, any that do relate to those significant weaknesses, if they're not addressed by the time that we get to conclude our audit for next year, there clearly remains a risk that that weakness would remain in place for the following year's conclusion.
Any follow-ups? No. Councillor Diaguides?
Yeah. I think, first of all, can I say I'm pleased that we reached the stage we've reached, and thank you to everybody, both your staff and our staff, because we are all aware of how difficult this year has been on that particular thing, nationally and locally, and the changes and so on. So absolutely thank you. I'm obviously concerned, like anybody else, about the qualifications that you have listed here. I'm partly reassured, I suppose, by saying that you have got good cooperation from our officers in general, from the authority. You recognize, the problems, etc. You don't have any criticisms about the way that we are responding as an authority, if I'm right, yeah? But taking that all into account, as well as other briefings that you've given us and what is in the report, I just want to confirm that you think that even if there were some discrepancies from what you found and what you were told, that it was not intentional, you didn't think that somebody was trying to cover up, first of all, that is important. And secondly, that you are broadly satisfied with the direction of the responses and where we're going. And if I understood it right, you might have some concerns about the speed with which we go about it and some of our infrastructure in terms of the information that we keep and how we're improving it. Am I right? I just wanted to confirm that. And I've got a second sort of like point afterwards, but so like do it after that or yeah.
Yeah, so I'll answer that question as best I can. I mean, our disclaimer, because you're primarily talking about the financial statements opinion here, and I will come on to say a little bit more about that, but in substance, our disclaimer is purely down to the backstop date. There is nothing there from the point of view of willingness of management to cooperate, support the process, that if we were allowed to go on to some undefined dates in the future, we may be able to fix that. Remain disclaimed, but putting that to one side. So generally, we have found management to be very cooperative with a desire to move in a similar direction to us to remove that modification in the future. And in fact, we spent some good time this morning in a session with management, analysing item by item of account how we can best move forward to remove those modifications in future. I think, and I'm sure management won't mind me saying this, there is an element of familiarity with the audit process that needs to be brought up to speed. And that primarily is where we are today. But I am confident that a lot of the issues we talked about this morning are within management's gift to resolve before we get to the point of signing off again next year.
You want to ask yourself?
Moving to the second part, I think you identified 4 broadly still concerns of high risk, in value for money, etc. The two in particular, procurement and commercial property management, the thing is something that this committee in particular has been pursuing. We have had responses. We will follow on that. I think a number of us have also concerns about your other finding in that Councillor Rossetti identified about the apparent, at least, excessive use of agency staff in comparison with other authorities and all that kind of thing, etc. I think I would suggest that the way for us to respond to your concerns, which are very serious, is that we actually continue demanding here, using our powers as an audit committee, to get regular reports of progress until we see resolution of those issues. I wonder whether you got any comment on that one, or will you suggest something else? Because we really need to sort out these particular issues. I mentioned the three here,
I mean, the reason we raise them, and I think there's a very similar document that management prepare in the annual governance statement, for example, where our conclusions should very much mirror your own assessment of internal control through the AGS. Now, as a key plank of internal control, they're absolutely things that the audit committee should have oversight of and ensure they're actioning. And going back to my response to the previous question, us flagging them as significant weaknesses with significant recommendations matched against them would probably give you some impetus. Maybe it's not all the impetus you need, but some impetus to say that unless these things are actioned, those weaknesses and arrangements will remain.
Tony, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I suppose just thinking of the annual governance statement only comes here once a year, twice a year. So let us take that away. I mean, I do think you will probably find yourself receiving updates through a number of different mechanisms, I suspect, through the year. So I know Minesh and I are looking at the audit plan for next year, for example, and I suspect financial sustainability will play a really key part in that. So, but let's take that away, and because I think it is helpful for the audit committee at least to get more regular updates. And we know that you've talked about procurement, and you've got separate reports coming as well. So let us try and map out what you might see when over the course of the next year, not just in the AGS.
Just thinking about the scheduling of the AGS. So you receive the AGS in July, and then I ordinarily bring an update to you sort of 6 months down the line. So we have that mechanism already to cog in the update on the recommendation if the committee feels that's okay.
Thank you. Is that okay, Councillor Diaguilis? Yep. Okay. So just hold on. So I got Councillor Mason.
Thank you, and thanks a lot for the report. I've taken on board what you've said about the other issues raised by my colleagues here. I'd like to just look at the issue around property management, social housing and commercial property. So I looked at and accept your social housing comments on page 35, but I am still very concerned about the number of voids, and I cannot accept that all the issues around voids and the question that we have a large level of voids and that costs us a lot of money, that is purely down to the that we have worse housing than most other boroughs. I mean, I'm a councillor in my local council. I went for a walk around my my area a couple of weeks, 5 weeks ago maybe, meeting different groups of tenants, and there were 6 voids, all of which had been voids for over 2 years, and many of which did not need any refurbishment because they had already had a surveyor's report which is over a year old. So I don't want to go into that detail. I'm just saying though that I can't accept that the issue, the conclusion that you raise around social housing and particularly the void level, I think it's a real issue for us, and it really needs to turn around. And I accept what you're saying about the commercial property, and that again has quite huge impacts locally because people see buildings which are owned by the council, which nothing is happening with, and they're boarded up. And so I think that there's the financial impact, which I completely get is your remit, but there is also the reputational impact and the democratic impact, if you like, where residents feel the council isn't being responsive to them. We know the background bits. We know the reasons, but the residents don't all know the reasons. And so I would like to see social housing, if it's possible, I don't know if it is, but I'd like to see voids being brought back in as something that we will keep an eye on. You might want to say it's a significant weakness, but I think that it needs to be there as a risk. Thank you.
I mean, just to respond to that point, and as management are aware, this is probably the one area where we had the most debate and challenge as to whether or not it merited the status of significant weakness. I believe I reached the right conclusion in the end. I think it was clearly a risk, and one that we spent a lot of time talking to housing leadership and other members of the exec or the directors on. I landed on the conclusion I did partly because we were then party to a lot of the correspondence with the regulator on some of these issues. And again, you're right, whilst voids is an area of concern, and it's certainly one that we felt appropriate to bring out in our commentary in the public report, our role is to assess whether or not there are weaknesses in arrangements that require resolution. And I think where we got to by the end, having sight of some of the assurances from, or the more positive tone of the correspondence from the regulator about the action that management had taken to address some of these issues, we felt more assured that actually it fell short of a significant weakness at this point, whilst accepting on ground level, if you like, there was still a lot of work to be done, but we could see that management started to put the foundations in place for how to respond to those. So you're right, it remains an issue, but one we're going to keep a watching brief on through the FY25 risk assessment. And it could be, if we don't feel that pace of response is as quick as we were led to believe it would be, that issue could then return to significant risk and weakness status in the future.
Thank you. So we're noting that it'll remain on the kind of list of things to be watched and to be reported back on. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Kathy.
So I'm just returning briefly to procurement in the sense, so on page 74, where you say that the implementation of a new procurement system is planned, and that will obviously help a lot. However, at the bottom, it's recommended, it just sort of says, the implementation alone will not lead to the improvements needed in the procurement practice and compliance, which will require a series of other actions. So, now that's what I'm really interested in, just because over the course of a few years, people have been coming back talking about procurement, and I found it very frustrating that they've always just said we've got this new system coming, and they haven't done anything else. And I just struck me that that was ridiculous. Surely there were smaller things, and on the ground, quite a lot that could be done.
Yeah, and I'm very conscious I still owe you an update report at your next committee on almost everything procurement. So I think we probably focused on the system over the last kind of 12 months or so. And look, I'm a really strong believer that a system is a tool. It doesn't change compliance, it doesn't change culture, it doesn't change behaviour, it doesn't. So when I refer to the other actions, the system will support, and actually it will support our compliance with the Procurement Act. It will help us to keep track of our contracts registered, help us to publish all the notices that we need to do under the new Procurement Act. It doesn't change the compliance and the behaviour. And I think some of the significant weaknesses that KPMG have picked up in their report, but also I think have been reported to this audit committee in the past, both through Manesh's internal audit report, but kind of separate internal audit review. So the annual report that Manesh does, but also the separate internal reports. So there is almost a back to basics to almost make sure that we've got the really robust, not just procurement, but also commissioning arrangement. So I quite often refer to it as a commissioning cycle. It's quite an old term now, but there's something about getting our procurement right, but there's also something about the commissioning as well. So there's quite a significant piece of work that is underway. So just to assure you, it really, the system supports and enables, the system will not resolve the issue. And I think probably might have been thought it would do in the future. But what I'm trying to do is address some of those other factors that we need to.
Happy? Okay.
So I'm hoping that we can actually see the speed.
Progress.
Do you know what I mean? Because sometimes we know we're told it's happening, but we can't actually see it happening.
The incentive is the amount. So across capital and revenue, we're spending about 600 million on contracts a year. So if you think about my earlier update and all the questions that you posed to me on exceptional financial support, there is absolutely an incentive to look at our contract spends, our procurement processes, and just to ensure that we're getting absolute value for money. That might be part of the solution to the 37 million shortfall.
Thank you, Taryn. Reyes?
Thanks. Tim, thanks for the report. I think everybody understands the extraordinary times we're in related to auditing the cycle and previous cycle and future cycles for at least the next 3 years or so. But from what you found and the fact that you couldn't do all your work, and it's a hypothetical question, but if you can give me a response, I would appreciate it, because I'm trying to sense the urgency of which management need to fix some of the issues that you've raised. So if in a normal year where you could do all your work, and these were the only findings of a significant nature that you found, would that have impacted your opinion? No, not value for money, the annual financial.
Can I come back to that question? I was just going to say a little bit on the ISA 260 report around the financial statements approach, which may or may not cover your point, and then by all means come back then if that's okay.
Right.
Right, thank you. I guess possibly for Taryn, just on the value for money, there's this sort of call for changing a culture, sort of taking ownership and responsibility. And I just wonder if you could speak to currently around savings target, where does the responsibility sit and with who? And if, I don't know if this can be made as a request, can we get in advance, given the expectation is to bring this forward in terms of planning, what the savings targets are across each of the kind of functions or work streams, and for us to really hold them to account as part of their updates to the Audit and Risk Committee, because I sort of feel like these targets are put out there almost as a bid to get the investment, but then it falls away. No one is able to come back and justify whether those savings have been achieved, whether it's been eroded, or whether it's just disappeared into thin air. And that accountability piece is frankly falling away. Thank you.
Okay, so just generally around savings, delivery of savings as opposed to savings targets. I think you've heard from previous reports that our track record isn't quite where we want it to be in terms of delivery of savings. I think you've seen that through internal audit reviews. It's been picked up again as part of KPMG's annual auditors report. What we've tried to do this year, so I think we have to accept that. So I think your question is really about what's different going forward. So we, as part of the work to develop the budget, we have gone back over existing savings, so those in the current year, but also those that might have been approved in previous years, like for future years. And we've challenged ourselves hard. We've challenged the budget holders, almost the people that are required to deliver the change to deliver the savings around the deliverability. Now, that has resulted, and it's set out in the budget report, which has been more realistic and having to write off some savings for previous years. And I think that's right. For a number of reasons, it could be because circumstances have genuinely changed. They could have gone in a couple of years ago. We've got some savings there, or they might have been superseded by doing something different now. So housing demand is a really good example of that. So we have challenged ourselves quite hard on existing savings. In terms of new savings, so if you would see the budget report, we've got between 22 and 23 million of new savings going in or proposed for next year's budget. We've gone to a similar level of scrutiny. So look, from an audit committee perspective, I can't it's very difficult for me to recommend a budget to the cabinet to then recommend to council that I don't think is achievable. And so that is about recognising pressures, but it's also about savings that are achievable. Now, have I got absolute assurance that we're going to achieve those savings 100%? Probably not. And therefore, that's where I've got my contingency to manage some of those risks around delivery. But we can't afford to not deliver any. So we have gone through that assurance piece. In year, we are going to be having a much tighter grip on the delivery of savings than what we have done in the past. So we have at the moment what we call category A projects, which is essentially the big transformation project. We do monitor those exceptional. There's a big framework around those, really good governance framework, but we often forget about all the other savings that we've got to deliver as a result. So there's going to be a much tighter corporate grip through myself and CLT about the delivery of all savings and holding people to account. So you asked about where does responsibility sit? Responsibility sits with the service. Now, I've got a role to play, Section 151, about making sure the savings, I think, are achievable to be able to build them into the budget. I have a role to hold people to account, to challenge, to make sure that we are our reg rating is accurate and our commentary is accurate. But ultimately, it's down to the service to deliver the changes that are needed and deliver the savings. So there's something about accountability there. It's very much two-way, but I would say during 25-26, we're going to see a much tighter corporate grip on not just the delivery of savings, I would say spending more generally, spending within budget, challenging those budget assumptions if anything deviates. So it's going to be a very different approach that we're going to see going forward.
That's really helpful. Culture as well.
Am I confident? So I'm confident enough to be able to build the savings and assume the savings in the budget at this stage. We've moved into a different era, I think, in terms of the local authority. We almost have no choice but to deliver the savings that we need to deliver. So I think there is a shift. I think there is a general acknowledgement across the organisation. I wouldn't say everywhere, but there is a general acknowledgement that we are in a different position. But I've also tried to adopt an approach this year with the budget about getting to a budget that everybody believes in. And I think that sometimes is half the battle. So it's very difficult for me to hold people to account if they don't believe savings are achievable or their budget is set right. So we've done a lot of work of trying, because I think that will help to shift the culture. But ask me in 12 months' time.
Great. And just one final follow-up. The tools that you have to be able to monitor it, because I see some mention about encouraging and perhaps businesses to be making use or full use of those monitoring tools. Are you as finance playing a supportive role in that space to ensure that your stakeholders internally are maximising the use of those?
You also. Do you want to repeat?
Did you catch it? It was just around the usage of the monitoring tools, because I don't know if there's an inference there that you've got the monitoring systems, but people aren't engaging with it.
So tools is quite a broad concept, isn't it? And I often refer to a kind of a toolkit. So I think there is more that we can do in this space in terms of these monitoring tool that we've got. We don't have one as such. So we're using Excel spreadsheets, but but I think tools is much wider than that. I go back to the procurement, and the system just enables good monitoring. It is around the conversations. It's about the understanding the budget holder has of their budget and the drivers and what's driving the forecast, almost that educational piece that we want to make. I want to make absolutely sure that 25, 26 are all budget, but to be able to held accountable for their budget, they need to understand what's driving that demand, that price. So there might be pockets in the organisation where we need to do a little bit more work. I also benchmarking as a tool, almost. So there is a range of different options that's available. Would we benefit from a monitoring system? Potentially in the future, I think I'd want to spend a bit of time doing that educational piece just to ensure that all budget managers have fully understood the budget that they've got, how they manage it, how they monitor it. Absolutely supported by finance. Some colleagues, there is no finance are actively involved, but we want to get them to a point where they are critical friend to the service and challenging and adding value in that way, as opposed to essentially number crunching, which is where the tool and system would come in. There is an improvement, I think, in the finance systems that we've got at the moment that we will need to be looking at going forward.
Thank you, Tyrone. So any questions for the value for money? Okay, Councillor Mason.
Just a quick one in relation to what's call you Councillor, can I? Rena said, which is about how monitoring budgets. That's great. One of the things I think is that we have created silos, and that the impact of the budget in this silo has really big implications for the budget in that, and that part of the learning that people need is to understand what those implications are and to be able to have those conversations. I'm sure you're aware of that, but I just wanted to know that that's on your agenda as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, solving our financial position, we will not be able to think of just those opportunities within individual services. The bigger changes and the bigger opportunities, as well as improving outcomes, I think come from that cross-working and that interdependencies. And I think I quite often give the example of transitions, it impacts on children's, adults and housing, we can't think in silos anymore at those opportunities. We should always look for efficiencies and better ways of doing things, but actually it needs a more fundamental change in terms of how we look at how we deliver services, which quite often deliver better outcomes and reduce costs. So that's where the focus needs to be over the next 12 to 18 months. It's just that those bigger changes take time, and therefore I want to move to a much longer term approach, thinking 2 to 3 years down the line, because some of the changes like that will take 2 to 3 years to really have an impact on the budget position.
Tim, do you want to continue with the financial statement?
Yeah, sure. So the second report that we've provided to you is what's called the ISA 260 report, or the audit completion report. Now, within that, we do provide a summary of the VFM conclusion that we've just been talking about, so I won't touch on that again in this report. But in this report, we do provide a lot more detail on the work we've been doing around the financial statements audit. Now, whilst the headline is that we will be issuing a disclaimer opinion on those accounts, I think in the detail we have picked out a few areas of specific focus, if you like, partly because we are able to give you assurance of those, which is a positive step, but also those areas where we haven't, and offered reasons why that might not be the case, and whether in this report or through the debrief process we discussed with management earlier, hoping to get to a point where we can remove those modifications next year. I think it's important to remember, and we articulate this probably on page 5 of our report 45 of the pack, is that this is a time constrained audit, and that is by design. Obviously, with the system approach that was set out to the backstop dates pre-Christmas and following the last election, it is by design that there is a backstop date in place to prevent audits going on and on and on, rather allowing the auditor to draw a line under that year, to have a proper debrief process and go again for the following year. And in doing that, have more timely reporting to you on the audit they're actually looking at. So again, whilst we're drawing a line under the audit for this year, we have already made a start on the FY25 audit with a view to bringing an audit plan for that to a meeting around Easter time. Those areas where we have been able to provide assurance are quite important ones. So income is an area where we have been able to provide you with assurance, and the quality of audit evidence was sufficient to allow us to do that. Equally, employee benefit expenses or payroll, which is by single line item the biggest area of expenditure for the authority, and that is no mean feat. So again, there's been a good response from management in providing us with the information we need. In fact, with the exception of social care spend, which relates specifically to a system issue, we have also been able to test effectively other operating expenses or non-pay costs, if you like. There was just an issue with a system migration in social care, which led to a bit of a gap in the information we're able to obtain on those. Crucially as well, from a liquidity point of view, loans and borrowings and also cash are areas that we have been able to conclude on. Now, that is an achievement, given they haven't been audited for 3 years. But also, it's probably fair to say that 1 or 2 of the items may have taken us longer than we would do in any normal year. But again, that's part of the debrief process to try and get it right first time within the FY25 audit, so that we remove a lot of that iterative evidence that we went through in the current cycle. In terms of the areas we haven't been able to provide assurance, again, the way we've gone about it is to approach every aspect of that work, if not to end up with a positive conclusion, in order to provide feedback to management on what evidence we would need to see in the following cycle to remove that modification. Now, I would say from the conversations we've had today and from the work we've done to date, we should be optimistic of being able to do that on the majority of balance sheet items, to therefore get to a point in the future when we can remove that. Clearly, the key point around the modification will remain the usable and unusable reserves, simply because they are largely driven by the transactions that flowed through your income and expenditure account in those disclaimed periods. So we need to work out a methodology, and there is conversations happening with other audit firms in the FRC at the moment around an approved methodology to do that, because the only way short of agreeing that methodology would be to audit the 3 disclaimed income and expenditure accounts, which from a time and cost point of view would be quite a significant amount. And also there's a risk, given it relates back to the 3 previous years, that some of that information may not be readily available and some of the corporate knowledge lost. So that is something we're trying to avoid in developing that methodology. So there's a lot more detail in the report, but I'd be happy to pause at that point and take any questions people have on the content of that report.
Thank you, Tim. Questions? No? Reyes had a question. Do you want to repeat the question for the sake of the minutes?
Yeah, sure. I'm not going to repeat the whole spiel on what everybody knows about the extraordinary circumstances. So ultimately, if it was a normal circumstance and you were able to complete all your work, and this is all you found from a significant risk perspective, would that have impacted your audit opinion from a qualified to unqualified? I know it's a hard question.
So essentially, any modification in our audit opinion this year is purely due to the backstop date. So again, there is sort of work we would have to do on particularly reserves and particularly the valuation of property, plant and equipment, which would mean us going back to previous periods, for example, the valuation report from FY23, for example, and doing work on that, which we just ran out of time on. But also what we're hoping to do is agree a more efficient, effective approach for FY25, which would mitigate the need to do a lot of that. So to answer your question, significant risk, that you're probably likely to see similar significant risks in our plan for FY25, because ultimately those significant risks are driven by either the largest or most subjective areas of your financial statements. For example, valuation of property pensions, the fraud risk around expenditure recognition is what we always see in the sector. There's nothing we've come across as part of our work which would suggest that there is a material error in all of those. We've just not been able to do sufficient work to say there isn't.
On a separate issue, on the journal entries, I guess I just wasn't clear of how significant the control deficiency is. And then secondly, of the 71 high-risk criteria journals, and I know you haven't done any work on that either, have you passed that on to management for them to vet? and please give us some assurance that there's nothing wrong with those entries?
Yeah, sure. So very specifically on the recommendation we've raised, that is a recommendation which we tend to see in 99% of public sector organisations. What we would like to see as auditors, and what is the most effective control from an audit point of view, is that you have 100% approval process on journals, so that when somebody posts a journal, that immediately goes to a different individual to approve that journal with an appropriate audit trail to give them the information they need to show that that is a valid journal. Based on the systems that often are available and the functionality that exists with some of the organisations we work with, that functionality doesn't always exist. And there's also a management capacity point that says, whilst it might be very effective from an audit point of view, it will take management a lot of time to implement that control. So what we usually see is a more refined control, which looks at things on a sort of a threshold basis to say over a certain level, they'll go for approval, or we will do a scan review of a batch of these journals. But again, that would slightly fall short of a control we can rely on as auditors. Now, management can respond to say they don't want to implement that. And effectively, we are just discharging our duty to you as those charged with governance to say you just should be aware of that situation. So it won't prevent us giving assurance on journals in the future, but we'd probably have to do more work on them than we would normally have to do because of that lack of control. In terms of the high-risk journals, again, that is just a process we needed to go through. We were chasing down sort of bits of evidence related to certain journals, and we just ran out of time, similar to some of the other areas. So again, that is something we can cover in the debrief process to look at, well, what is the best quality of evidence that we can get? And indeed, we picked that up in conversation today around what management might want to do at the point of the journal being posted, rather than just await us picking something and then looking for the evidence.
I guess, and there's probably a question for Taryn. I mean, as your team have cited those journals to make sure that they hit red flag criteria, but are actually valid journals.
That might be helpful for me to clarify what those, they're not high risk by management's definition, and they may not even be high risk by your definition. What we're saying is we would apply a series of lenses to our journal screening, such as, journals posted by a certain individual, somebody that we may not expect to post journals on a day-to-day basis. And that person may have posted a journal for entirely valid reasons, but that's just something we've picked for that reason. So they may be different to what management would deem to be high risk.
So I was just going to see, Katie, do you want to talk briefly through the approval process for journals, just to give some assurance to the committee?
Yeah, thanks. I think our journal process is such that let me start by clarifying my understanding of that recommendation. Really, it's more around management bringing in a review, a certain level of review of the journals has been posted. Like Tim pointed out, ideally what they would expect in terms of the protocol or the approval levels for journal, our system cannot provide it, but we have a mechanism in place for posting journals where journals above 50K are reviewed by senior officers, posted. In terms of posting of our journals, obviously, whoever raises the journal, a different person raises the journal, it goes through approval. If it's coming from the service, by service ADs reviews it, approves it, and then someone else posts it. For if 50K and above, someone packs it, and then a different person now reviews it and posts those journals. And also, when it comes to us as the head of finances of different areas, we also review those journals. So like if a journal is raised under my area, another head of finance will review it and then, before the journal is posted. But I think here we're talking about doing a spot check of journals or a review of journals, collection of journals posted within a period. Someone senior looking at them and saying, okay, who posted this at what time? And most importantly, documenting who has reviewed it before to see whether that person has the appropriate rights to review journals of that level. So, which is something we've welcomed. We need to look at it and see how that sits in terms of time required and whether we already have mitigations in place to ensure that maybe to negate whatever risk that might likely come out of that. So.
You're not.
No, that's fine. I mean that just talks to preventative versus detective type controls. Yeah, okay.
Okay, is there any further questions from the members? No? Tim, are you going to continue or you come to end?
I wasn't proposing to say anything about the third item, so happy to close there if there's no more questions.
I just got a quick question, if I may. So what's your experience have been with the management thus far? And plus for the 4 areas that which you have highlighted as significant weaknesses, management has obviously responded to those weaknesses. Will there be further engagement ensuring that those measures are implemented within the area, so you can come up to some sort of assurance down the line?
So I'll just pick up the point around VFM weaknesses, then I'll come back to management. In terms of following up the VFM weaknesses, yes, we would do that as part of our FY25 risk assessment. And it comes back to my previous comment that if we didn't feel that recommendation had been addressed satisfactorily, they would remain risks, if not weaknesses, in the FY25 audit. So absolutely, we will be looking at all those areas, and not just the significant ones. I think I mentioned before areas like social housing, and some of the governance weaknesses which we decided weren't significant, we will still look at again to check that there's been no significant change in those areas. In terms of management's approach to the audit, I'd like to thank them because it has been a very difficult period for them. You know, they've been without auditor challenge for quite a while, and with that comes an element of, to use maybe a strange phrase, ring rustiness in how you respond to an audit. But I think it was one of the first visits we had to Haringey, there was a real desire from sort of wider members of the finance team to actually get involved with the audit. You know, I think we did a walkthrough of revenue, and I think there was about 10 people wanted to sit in on it just so they could have the experience of what it was like. And I think it's a really important part of professional development. You know, audit isn't often seen as the most important part of finance, but actually, when you're a professional financial accountant, you do want to have that experience of audit. It's quite a learning, defining experience. So, you know, yes, there've been problems. And again, I've said this before, but I think those problems largely come from an unfamiliarity with the level of the request. It doesn't come from a place, certainly from what we've experienced to date, from a place where there is a resistance to providing that information. So I think the conversation we had this morning was done in a positive, constructive spirit. You know, there were no points we were raising where, you know, people were sat back with arms folded, shaking their heads saying, no, we're not going to do that. It was genuinely met with open minds and with a genuine positive desire to move it forward. And, you know, I think everybody on both sides of the table would hope to be in a position in 12 months' time where there were fewer modifications, both on value for money and financial statements.
Thank you. You got, yeah. All right, go on. Okay.
Thank you. Just one final question from me, and it was just about the fraud and sort of taking advantage of the 160k threshold. What measures are being put in place to address that?
So almost, I suppose independently, I think of the report that you're seeing tonight. So as you're right, 160k threshold requires more flexible controls, shall I say, in terms of that approval to go out to procurement. We are looking at changing that. It's difficult for me to say in this public meeting because they're still in draft at this stage, but we are looking to bring in some tighter controls and challenging ourselves as to whether that 160,000 limit is too high, and I suspect it is. So we're going through that review process at the moment. We are also looking at our low spend contracts, so even well below, so particularly our contracts at less than 10,000, where there's very limited control in terms of those, but when you look at that spending, it's quite high. So I think there's something around, it almost comes back to the question I got about a system can't solve that. There's something about a change in behaviour to understand the procurement rules, and the contract standing orders. So there is a whole communications and engagement piece that I think we need to do with everybody that's involved in any purchasing of any sort, just to remind them of their responsibilities and approval. So I suppose there's two things. There's that wider education piece and reminding people. There is the use of data and compliance data. So we're preparing reports so that we can get almost, I call them corporate health type indicators that we can report on, and we can identify areas where perhaps there isn't that compliance, so the approval wasn't sought, or extensions and waivers, etc. We're focusing on our small value contracts, so those less than 10,000, and I think just generally because of I think we would be doing that anyway, but because of the council's financial position, it's even more imperative that we do it and pick up pace on that, given the amount that we spend. And then almost aside to that, we're looking at a more formal review of whether that 160k threshold is too high and that needs reducing. So that's.
Okay, so if there's no any further questions on this item, I'm just going to read the recommendation for this item. So the recommendation is 1, that the committee consider the content of the report and any further oral updates given at the meeting by KPMG. 2, that the committee notes the audit finding report of the auditors, KPMG, and the management responses in the KPMG action plan contained within the report. 3, that the committee gives the chair of the committee and the chief finance officer, section 151 officer, authority to sign the letter of representation to the auditor. 4, that the committee delegates the approval of the statement of accounts 2023-2024, subject to any final changes required by the consultation of the audit to the chair and the chief financial officer, S151 officer. Agreed? Thank you so much. Our next meeting is on 11th of March. Before everybody leaves, I just got a news to read. So Benita is leaving Haringey. I would like to thank for her work and her dedication, and the committee can join me thanking Benita for all her hard work in Haringey and dedication. And I wish you all the best in the future. Okay, so we can end the meeting now.